He was fired on the spot for handing a sandwich to an old man in the cold. Not stealing, not arguing, just offering a cup of coffee, a warm jacket, and a meal paid with his own card to someone silently trying to open trash-salvaged bread behind the dumpster. Ethan Cole didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice, didn't explain himself. He simply nodded and walked back into the night, knowing full well what kindness had cost him. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was who that old man truly was. The next morning, 6 military Humvees filled the parking lot. A general in full dress uniform stepped out, walked into that same gas station, and asked for the name Ethan Cole. By then the cameras were already rolling. Sometimes honor wears worn boots and duct-taped soles. Sometimes justice walks slowly, but salutes sharply. And sometimes the world only pays attention after the quietest among us choose to act. If you've ever believed that dignity shouldn't depend on a job title or clean clothes, keep watching. Type honor in the comments. And stay with us. If you still believe the right thing, even when quiet echoes farthest. Ethan Cole was 28, lean and quiet, with dark circles permanently etched beneath his eyes like bruises that never healed. His brown hair was always a little too long, tucked behind ears burned by long Florida nights, and his quick-stop uniform hung loose on his wiry frame. Customers barely noticed him, but those who worked the night shift knew. Ethan never forgot a coffee order, never missed a trash run, never raised his voice. There was a stillness to him, not cold, but composed, like someone who had learned the cost of letting emotion spill. Every midnight, precisely at 12:07, he took his break, sat on the crate behind the store, lit no cigarette, made no calls. Just stared at the stars as if searching for a version of himself still out there. He lived alone in a studio off 49th, surviving on boxed dinners, library books, and the kind of silence that only came from too much loss. 3 years ago, he'd been a journalism student at the University of South Florida. 3.8 GPA, student press honors, a bright path forward, until his mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The VA barely helped. The bills piled up. He dropped out to take care of her, working 2 jobs until the night she died. Since then, the world had mostly passed him by. The neighbors knew his name but never asked question. His manager, Perry Stevens, called him dependable but replaceable. Ethan had served no time in uniform, but his late grandfather had. Sergeant Gerald Cole, USMC, retired. Ethan kept his dog tags tucked beneath his shirt, though no one at the store had ever seen them. He never spoke of it, but every time a Marine came in wearing a patch or a pin, Ethan stood a little straighter behind the counter. That night, just before closing, Perry had made an offhand remark, "Don't go soft on me, Cole. This place attracts enough trash." Ethan didn't answer. He just tightened the cuffs of his sleeves and stepped outside, not knowing that someone already lay huddled behind the dumpster, waiting. The night was quiet in the way only 10 can be. Parking lot empty, highway murmuring faintly in the distance, the cold pressing in from every direction. Ethan stepped out with the trash bag slung over one shoulder, the other hand stuffed in his pocket, fingers brushing the edges of his grandfather's dog tags beneath the uniform shirt. He rounded the corner toward the dumpster, then stopped. A figure sat hunched against the brick wall, almost part of the shadows. The man's beard was long, tangled with bits of leaves, his coat more patchwork than cloth, shoes wrapped in layers of duct tape like armor against the world. He wasn't begging. He wasn't even aware someone was watching. With trembling fingers, he fumbled with a plastic bread package, the kind convenience stores toss when expiration dates hit. The bag was damp, stubborn. He kept trying, kept failing. Ethan stood motionless for a moment. Then he turned and walked back inside. No one saw him make the sandwich. No one noticed as he brewed fresh coffee, folded a paper towel around a turkey sub, and reached into his locker for the old fleece jacket he kept for chilly dawns. He rang everything up, paid from his own break allowance, and printed the receipt like any other transaction. The back door creaked open again. "Sir," Ethan said gently, setting the food down at arm's length. "You looked cold." The man looked up, eyes bleary, but not empty. "I can't pay you, son." "It's already paid for," Ethan said softly. No speeches, no pity. Just fact. Just dignity. But before the man could even reach for the sandwich, headlights sliced across the lot. A silver BMW rolled in fast, its engine too clean for a place like this. Perry Stevens. Night check. The door slammed, keys jangling, and then, "What's going on here, Cole?" Ethan didn't flinch. "Just taking a break, sir." Perry's eyes fell to the jacket. The food. "You gave him store product?" "I paid for it," Ethan replied, reaching into his pocket, holding out the receipt like a shield made of paper. Perry didn't even look. "We don't serve this kind here. You know that." "He wasn't asking for anything," Ethan said. Still calm. "That's not your call to make." Perry's voice rose, shrill now. "This is why we have rules. First it's 1, then it's 10. You want the lot of them sleeping back here?" Silence. From Ethan. From the old man. From the 2 teens at pump 4 pretending not to hear. From Melissa behind the counter, who looked up and then quickly looked down. "You gave him food?" Perry demanded. Ethan nodded once. "Then you're fired. Finish your shift and get out." Perry slapped the termination form on the counter inside, hard enough to echo. But no one moved. No one stopped him. No one except the old man, who slowly stood, reached out, and took the sandwich with careful hands. Then, before turning away, he looked straight at Ethan and offered a crisp, wordless salute. And that's when something shifted. Something too quiet for Perry to hear, but loud enough to be noticed. The back door slammed shut behind Ethan, like the end of a chapter no one wanted to read. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed. Melissa glanced up from the register as he walked in slowly, peeled off his name tag, and placed it gently on the counter beside the unsigned termination form. His locker was already empty. He'd known how this would go. No one said a word. Perry stood with arms crossed, lips pursed, tapping the end of his pen against the clipboard like a drumbeat of finality. The silence wasn't thick, it was hollow, like everyone was holding their breath, unsure what had just happened, or what it would cost. Outside, the man Ethan had fed was now only a silhouette disappearing into the night. Sandwich in hand, jacket zipped to the throat. But before he turned the corner, he paused and adjusted something on his wrist. A bracelet, thin, metallic, worn with time, caught the faint orange of the parking lot light. Ethan saw it clearly. 3 words engraved into the band surface, each letter blackened with age. USMCOI. 1983. Taught. Sergeant Hale. The image struck him. Not like a realization, but like a memory he hadn't known he carried. His grandfather wore one just like it. Same era, same steel. Never took it off even when his hands shook too hard to grip a cup. Ethan's chest tightened. He opened his mouth to say something, but then the door chimed. A new figure stepped through the front entrance. Not rushed, not uncertain. Just present. The entire room shifted. Melissa straightened. Perry turned his head, and Ethan froze. The man was in his 50s, tall and broad across the chest, wearing civilian clothes that didn't hide the squared shoulders of a lifetime in uniform. Close-cut, silver hair. Clean shave. Eyes like cut glass. Hard, still, unflinching. He didn't blink as he looked around. Jaw locked. Boots planted. Nothing about him said customer. Everything said command. He walked up to the counter with the deliberate calm of someone who never needed to hurry. Said nothing at first. Just looked at Ethan. Then, at Perry. then to the tablet on the wall displaying live camera feeds. His gaze paused for a heartbeat on the backlot angle, where a frame of the old man's exit still lingered. Then, in a voice so low it barely touched the air but made the fluorescent buzz fall silent, he asked, "Which one of you turned him away?" No one answered. No one had to. And when his hand rested slowly on the counter, fingers curled, like they remembered saluting the same man decades ago, everybody in the store understood. No one needed an introduction. Everyone knew what came next. The room had shrunk, not in size but in breadth. Like the air had thickened, refusing to carry sound or movement. The tall man, still nameless to everyone but known to every instinct in the room, stood between Ethan and Perry, without raising his voice, without taking a step closer. Just standing, like a line drawn in concrete. Perry chuckled, the sound brittle. "You military types always show up like this, for a sandwich and a sob story?" He gestured lazily toward Ethan, then to the empty back door. "The guy's gone. Probably halfway to the next dumpster by now." The man didn't flinch. He reached into his coat pocket, not rushed, not threatening. From it, he pulled a black phone, military-issued, the kind that didn't ring often but never rang for small things. He tapped once, then turned the screen outward. The screen played the footage from last night, captured from the store's own security system. There was Ethan, setting down the sandwich, the coffee, the jacket. Perry entering, accusing, yelling. The audio clear. The receipt in Ethan's hand. The silence that followed. And finally, the old man's salute. The general let the clip run a second longer. Then he spoke. Major General Harvey L. Brennan, former commander, 2 combat stars, PTSD, traumatic brain injury, medically retired, missing for 72 hours. He paused, then added, with surgical calm, "And you threw him out." No one moved. Melissa had frozen behind the lottery counter, one hand still gripping the drawer. The 2 teens by the slushy machine had stopped pretending they weren't listening. A delivery driver halfway through the door stood still like he'd entered a crime scene and didn't know where to step. Perry tried to scoff, but the sound came out hollow. "We couldn't have known. He looked like—" "You didn't have to know his rank," the man cut in, voice still level. "You just had to know he was human." Then he turned, slightly, eyes still locked on Perry, and said the thing that ended the room. "You wrote him up for compassion." The weight of those words settled like ash. Perry's mouth opened, then closed. His smirk didn't return. His pen, still in hand, now rested against the clipboard like a weapon he no longer knew how to use. Outside, the wind had stilled. Inside, the hum of the cooler seemed louder than it should have been. And for the first time that night, Perry Stevens blinked. Not in defiance. Not in arrogance. But in something smaller. Something colder. He blinked like a man who'd just remembered how many cameras were in this store. By the time the sun broke through the haze over Tampa, Quick Stop was no longer a convenience store. It felt like a pressure chamber. The corporate men had arrived in suits that looked expensive but didn't carry weight here. Not like the uniform that stood beside the counter, hands folded, eyes locked on the security footage looping behind the glass. It was no longer about policy. It had become a reckoning. The video played again, this time, on a mounted tablet with higher resolution and louder sound. Ethan offering food without fanfare. The homeless man struggling with the bread. The moment the jacket was draped over his shoulders, like it meant more than warmth. Then Perry appeared on screen. Stern, accusatory, dismissive. And the moment that would haunt the room. The old man's salute, crisp despite the rags. Silent but louder than anything Perry had shouted. The general said nothing at first. He let the silence grow thick and dry, like the seconds before a storm finally breaks. Then he turned to the table, tapped a point on the video, and spoke clearly. Major General Harvey Brennan, U.S. Marine Corps, decorated, retired, missing for 72 hours, You threw him out like garbage." Perry swallowed, lips parting but no sound coming. "I didn't know who he was," he stammered. "He looked like—" He didn't say. "You didn't need to know who he was," the general cut in. "You just needed to act like you still believed people matter." Behind the counter, Melissa stepped forward, quiet but steady. She held up the receipt, Ethan's receipt, the timestamp matching the video, the amount paid in full. "He didn't take," she said softly. "He gave." The customers didn't speak, but the shame spread like smoke. One man lowered his coffee. A woman looked at her feet. From the back, someone whispered, "I saw it all," and said nothing. And then the final thread pulled loose. A black SUV rolled up outside. The door opened. A military officer stepped out, boots polished, gaze unwavering, clipboard in hand. He entered the store without fanfare, nodded once to the general, and turned to Perry. "Mr. Stevens," he said, "you're under review for violating protocol regarding the treatment of a high-ranking veteran. You'll be removed from this location, pending further action." Perry didn't argue. He didn't even ask what further action meant. His eyes dropped. His hands, once so quick to point and scold, now hovered useless at his sides. He signed the form without reading it. No one clapped. No one spoke. The air said enough. And when he left, head lowered, shoulders small, it was the first time Perry Stevens truly looked like a man who knew he'd been seen. At first, no one moved. The store, once just another forgettable pit stop on the edge of town, stood frozen in a silence thicker than any that had filled it before. The hum of the freezer, the faint buzz of the neon sign, even the squeak of worn tile underfoot, all seemed to dim, as if ashamed to break the stillness. Ethan didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply stood near the door, the same way he had stood behind that register for over a year, calm, present, without demand. A woman near the back who'd come in every morning for scratch tickets clutched her purse tighter and took a small step forward. Her eyes, usually sharp with habit, were now rimmed with something heavier. Guilt, maybe. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not to anyone in particular, but to the space between them. It was enough. Then the older man in the fishing jacket, who'd watched it all from the corner booth, walked to the counter and laid down a $5 bill. "Coffee for him," he said, voice gravelly but clear, nodding at Ethan. "And for anyone wearing boots like those." His eyes flicked toward the general, but didn't linger. He didn't need to be seen. He just needed to act. Melissa moved quietly, pouring 2 cups without asking names. Her hands, which had trembled the day before under Perry's scolding gaze, now moved with a steady grace. When she slid the cup toward Ethan, her fingers brushed his lightly. Not for attention, but for acknowledgement. No one clapped. No one cheered. But the weight in the room shifted, almost imperceptibly, like pressure easing from a wound. Outside, the first customer to leave the store held the door open longer than needed, glancing back at Ethan, as if seeking permission to walk away. He got a nod, and that was enough. Another man who'd pretended to browse gum during the entire exchange came back in, placed a Veterans Affairs pamphlet on the counter, and simply said, "This place should have had this all along." Even the district manager, who had spent most of the morning buried in his phone, took off his corporate badge, placed it on the counter with a sigh, and muttered, "Time to rethink everything." But Ethan, he just looked toward the small American flag above the refrigerator, the one most people never noticed, and said quietly, almost too softly to hear, "This place used to feel like home. Maybe it still can." It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a declaration. It was a thread offered. No strings, no shame, just a thread. And somehow, that thread began to stitch something back together. The fluorescent lights above the counter still buzzed faintly, but the air beneath them had changed, not with noise or banners or applause, but with the quiet weight of something once broken slowly being mended. where discount posters used to curl at the edges, now stood a single glass frame, centered and lit with soft reverence. Holding the old fleece jacket Ethan had given away. Below it, mounted without ceremony by local veterans who came before sunrise with calloused hands, and a drill between them, a bronze plaque read simply, "To those who serve and those who still see them." No names, no logos, just a sentence that stayed in your chest after you read it. No ribbon cutting followed, no grand reopening, just a different kind of silence, the kind where people held doors longer, spoke a little softer, and looked each other in the eye not out of habit, but out of rediscovered respect. Each Friday afternoon, a small cluster of high school raw chew students gathered by the coffee machine, not to buy anything, but to observe. One of them, Elena, carried a worn notebook and filled it with quiet notes. Her essay, "The Man Who Didn't Raise His Voice," later won a statewide competition. She had never spoken to Ethan, but left a copy of her essay on the counter inside an envelope folded like a flag. Veterans Affairs staff began stopping by without being asked. No inspections, just conversations over lukewarm coffee. A new pamphlet rack had been added near the register. Resources for those who served. It was always full in the morning, always empty by evening. Ethan never returned as an employee. He came now and then, once to restock that rack, once to sweep the corner where the old freezer still buzzed, sometimes just to nod at Melissa. People tried to thank him. He would smile, say something about the weather, and redirect their praise toward others. He never retold the story. He didn't have to. By then, the story had become theirs, told by strangers in line, painted into murals, whispered by kids pointing at the jacket in the frame. One boy asked, "Did he save someone?" His father paused, looked at Ethan's reflection in the cooler door, and said, "No, son." He reminded us who we are. Ethan saw the exchange. He didn't say a word, just nodded. Slow, steady, final, and that was enough. They sat in the quietest corner of the coffee shop. No uniforms, no salutes, no questions left to answer. Just two men, bound not by duty, but by something older, something quieter, something that had waited years for this silence to arrive. The sunlight filtered through the dusty blinds in stripes across their table, casting long shadows across two paper cups that had gone lukewarm in the time it took for neither of them to speak. The noise of the world carried on elsewhere, distant cars passing, the soft hum of the fridge behind the counter, the occasional creak of a stool shifting under the weight of someone not brave enough to interrupt what was happening in this small, sacred corner of the morning. Ethan leaned forward just slightly, his elbows resting on the edge of the table, fingers circling the rim of his cup like he was unsure whether to hold on or let go. Across from him, his father sat with his hands folded, shoulders that had once carried command now slouched under the weight of years no one had recorded. His voice, when it came, was barely more than breath. "Didn't think I'd need you again." Just 7 words, but they landed like an old door closing gently behind a man who'd been walking too long. Ethan didn't reply. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached slowly into his jacket pocket and drew out something small, wrapped in a piece of napkin, worn soft with time. He slid it across the table without a sound. His father unfolded it carefully, and there it was, the old USMC bracelet, scratched, dented, but unmistakable. The man's fingers trembled as he touched it, as if afraid it might vanish if he gripped too hard. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he slipped it back onto his wrist, not to reclaim glory, but to remember who he still was. They said nothing more. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full. Full of everything they'd never managed to say. Full of nights spent apart and words swallowed in pride. The air between them felt heavier now, but also cleaner. A small radio played near the window. Some old blues tune that neither of them named, but both recognized. Ethan smiled faintly, eyes still watching the light inch its way across the table. His father mirrored it with a nod. Not big, not dramatic, but enough. Then, without any signal, they both stood up at the same time. His father reached for his coat, and as he slid it on, he did something Ethan hadn't seen since childhood. He gently placed his hand on his son's shoulder, not for balance, but for connection. They didn't hug. They didn't shake hands. They just stood there for a moment, shoulder to shoulder, both facing the same direction. And when they stepped outside into the sunlight, they didn't look back. The door shut quietly behind them. The coffee still steamed on the table. But it was no longer about what was left behind. It was about what would be carried forward. The story didn't stay inside that coffee shop. It began to move quietly, without fanfare, through the town's veins like an old melody people thought they'd forgotten, only to hum it again without knowing why. A middle school teacher read a short essay aloud in homeroom, written by a boy who'd been there that night, hiding behind the candy rack when it all unfolded. He didn't shout, the essay ended. He just stood. That line echoed through the hallway long after the bell rang. At the local barber shop, one of the older patrons spoke softly between snips of clippers. "You know the guy who used to walk past here with the duct-taped boots? Turns out that wasn't just a homeless vet. That was Frank Delaney. Yeah, that Frank Delaney." And the room, once noisy, went still. Not because anyone told them to, but because something about the name made you sit up straighter. In the church bulletin, beneath notices for choir rehearsal and bake sales, someone had slipped in a grainy black and white photo of Frank from his service days. No caption, just a name. And still, the congregation looked at it longer than anything else that Sunday. Younger folks began changing in ways they couldn't fully explain. A teenager stopped one afternoon to reattach a flag that had slipped from its pole outside the courthouse. No one had asked, no one saw, but he did it anyway. A grocery clerk, barely 20, began offering to carry bags for older customers he used to ignore. At the library, 2 high school students whispered about starting a project interviewing veterans in the neighborhood. "You think they'd talk to us?" one asked. Maybe not, but maybe someone once did that for Frank. And through it all, Frank said nothing. He never corrected anyone, never explained what happened that night, never tried to claim any attention. He still sat in the same spot near the square, still wore that old fleece jacket on colder days. But the looks he got had changed. Where once there had been avoidance, now there was acknowledgement. People nodded. Some stopped to say thank you. Others simply paused, took him in, and walked away changed. The story lived on because others carried it. Ethan told it once during a community gathering, voice steady, eyes damp, ending only with, "My father reminded me what it means to be seen." A letter from a retired Marine was pinned up in the post office. We served together. He led without shouting, fought without fear, and still teaches us without ever speaking. Over time, the town stopped calling him that vet behind the gas station and started saying his name. Frank. That was all. And it was enough. Because in that name lived everything they wished they'd said sooner. One afternoon, a boy no older than 12 stood quietly in front of a glass display at the new Veterans Corner. Inside sat a folded flag, a photo, and that same fleece jacket. The boy didn't speak, just stared, his hand slowly raised into a salute. No one prompted him. Outside, the wind caught a banner overhead, red, white, and blue, snapping high above the quiet street. And the story kept moving, as stories like his always do. That evening, as the sun folded gently behind the rooftops, Frank sat in his usual spot at the corner of Veterans Stop, the same fleece jacket draped over his shoulders, now neatly framed behind glass just inside. A boy passed by, hesitated, then returned to read the brass plaque beneath the jacket. His lips moved silently, tracing the words. Dignity is not what you're given. It's what you protect when no one else does. Inside the shop, the chatter had faded. The coffee machine hissed once and stilled. A soft breeze stirred the flag outside, newly hung, bright and clean, its edges snapping sharp in the golden light. People didn't speak. They just stood, facing the window where Frank remained. No speeches, no applause, just a stillness that said everything. Frank didn't wave. He didn't nod. He simply looked at them, and they looked back, until someone whispered, "He's still teaching us." If you felt that silence, comment on her. And if you believe stories like Frank's must keep being told, then walk with us. Subscribe for more stories that remind the world. Dignity never begs to be seen. It simply stands.